world wars change worlds. And if you have a global agenda, then global problems allow you to offer global solutions. And if you look how the world was transformed by the First World War and the Second World War, the world was a completely different place after both of those wars. And the idea all along has been to have a third world war to complete the transformation into a global state with a world government and a world army dictating to the global population. There was a letter, a controversial letter, and it was a letter written by a man called Albert Pike, who was a massive Freemason in the United States in the 19th century. And it detailed 3 world wars that would transform global society. And the first one described it in the terms that happened. The second one it described in terms that it happened. The credibility of what it said lies in what it said about the Third World War. And it talked about creating a conflict between the Muslim world and what it called political Zionism. This is an agenda that's projected a long way forward. This is why Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, and Eric Blair, George Orwell, 1984, who knew each other. 1932 that Huxley's book was published, 1948 that Orwell's book was published, and they are describing the society that's unfolding today at that time. And there are many other examples of people predicting the future who were insiders, have turned out to be incredibly accurate. Albert Pike would know that this Zionist movement was coming and the establishment of Israel was coming. He was talking about the Muslim world being brought into a war with political Zionism, what today we call Israel, and that this would, in my terms, create a vortex that would draw in the world, in our terms, America, the European Union, NATO, into this war. That the plan was to create a massive divide and rule conflict between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. I know it's hard to believe for anyone frickin' sane that John Kerry has gone to Iraq and he said, well, we don't know about bloody airstrikes because, we might kill civilians. Well, that's never stopped you in the past, mate, has it? Or any of your predecessors. And what it seems to me as I'm reading this is that they're all standing off to let this ISIS get a big foothold in that region. And then if it moves to the point where it starts to threaten Israel, then the button will be pressed. Then the Americans and NATO will come in because they're committed to protecting Israel's security. And then you'll start to see why that sliver of land called Israel with less than 8 million people, because what Pike was talking about was drawing all these disparate groups in and creating this vortex of mutual self-destruction. The idea is for this Third World War to involve Russia and China against the West. What you have now is the demonization of Russia. Have you noticed that? And what's opening up in the Ukraine, it's very easy to see how Russia can be pulled into this Middle Eastern conflict, and Russia would come out in support of Iran, and the same would happen with China. You can see how the pieces in the game are being moved around to create the scenario that Pike talked about. The idea is to basically bring everything to its knees so that the world would have to be rebuilt in its structure and the way it operates. That would be in the image of what they've been working towards all along. World government, world central bank, world army, world currency, centralized control of the planet. What is happening in the Middle East is not random. None of it's been random. Libya's not been random, Syria's not been random, none of it. And ISIS certainly isn't random. It's part of this long-term plan to take over the world by creating enormous chaos to which they can offer the order out of the chaos, their order, their new world order. A close aide of President Putin, who has special responsibility for Ukraine, has actually said that the United States is preparing for a war against Russia through Ukraine. And if you start a front against Russia on its borders, and then all this stuff going on in the Middle East, you are diluting Russia's impact on what's happening in the Middle East. Yeah. It's all a setup. And when you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are 51st states of the United States, there are many of those, mind, funding this ISIS and funding this terrorism, while the Americans, who could tell them to stop any time, are condemning the very terrorism that their 51st states are supporting. Well, the picture's so bloody obvious. It's a setup, and it's a setup to attempt to trigger World War III.
And that's why you see Russia trying to back their economy with gold. That's why they're making better business relations with China. They're selling oil to each other right now, and they're moving away from all this.
Yeah.
But Putin's ego is very strong. They could provoke him, and you don't know how Putin will respond.
Well, it's a progression. You have to connect the dots to see the progression. Going into Afghanistan was stage one, justified by the lie about 9/11 and who was really behind it. Then they go into Iraq. That has created the situation where this ISIS can now run riot. They want to go down into Africa, and so they're creating terrorism all over Africa. One of the big blocks to what they wanted was Colonel Gaddafi, and so they had to get rid of him. That was what the Libya thing was about, where they trained, armed and funded rebels to attack the Gaddafi regime. It's all unfolding with the magician behind, or the puppet master behind the scenes. When we realize that, we can see that events are not random, but coldly calculated. These people are sheer, undiluted evil, and people need to understand that. Otherwise, they will reject that anyone could do what they're doing and kill and maim and slaughter so many people. They can do it because they have no heart, they have no empathy, they have no emotional compassion, and thus mayhem is their currency, and they have no emotional consequence. They are not like us, so don't judge what they'll do by what you would do, because it ain't the same thing.